What if one battle, in the frigid winter of 1942, changed the entire course of history? Stalingrad, a city that had once represented the might and hope of a nation, would become the brutal battlefield where the fate of World War II was sealed. What happened here wasn't just a clash of armies, but a clash of ideologies, endurance, and sheer human will. It was a place where every inch of ground was fought for with relentless fury, and where victory or defeat would decide the future of nations. Hitler's Third Reich, which had been unstoppable across Europe, was now poised to capture the Soviet Union's industrial heartland. The Germans believed Stalingrad would fall within weeks. But no one foresaw what would unfold in the ruins of this devastated city. The Soviet Red Army, backed by the unwavering resolve of Stalin's leadership, had a very different plan. What would happen when a military juggernaut collided with the unyielding spirit of the Soviet people? The battle for Stalingrad would become the largest and bloodiest confrontation of the war, with over 2 million casualties and an unimaginable level of destruction. But more than the sheer number of lives lost, the battle symbolized the resilience of humanity in the face of annihilation. When Stalingrad finally fell to the Soviets, it didn't just mark the defeat of the German Sixth Army. It marked the beginning of the end for the Nazi regime. This is the story of how one battle, one city, turned the tide of history forever. The gathering storm. What would it take for a powerful nation to be driven to the edge of desperation, as it stood at the brink of complete collapse? The summer of 1942 was pivotal in the Second World War. By this point, Hitler's forces had stormed through Europe with stunning success. With the fall of France and the relentless blitzkrieg that had taken cities across the Soviet Union, the Germans believed their victory was inevitable. But they had made a grave miscalculation. They underestimated the resolve of the Soviet people and, more importantly, the significance of Stalingrad. For Stalin and the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was more than just a city. It was a symbol of Soviet strength, resilience, and the indomitable will to survive. It was a place where history had been made, named after the Soviet leader himself. It was the epitome of Soviet industrial might and the gateway to the oil-rich Caucasus region, a prize the Nazis desperately sought. If Stalingrad fell, the Soviet Union would be crippled. And Hitler knew this. Hitler's obsession with capturing the city was not just strategic, it was symbolic. Stalingrad would represent the final blow to the Soviet will. To humiliate Stalin and decimate the Russian heartland would leave them reeling. But for the Soviets, the defense of Stalingrad was nothing short of a do-or-die scenario. Stalin, known for his ruthlessness and cold determination, issued a brutal decree: not one step back. This was the rallying cry that reverberated across the Soviet Union, urging the defenders of the city to dig in their heels and fight until the last man. By the summer of 1942, the German army, led by the ruthless General Friedrich Paulus, was on the march to Stalingrad. Their confidence was unshaken, and their goals were clear: conquer Stalingrad, crush Soviet morale, and gain control of the vast resources of the South. Little did they know, they were about to walk into a trap that would forever change the course of the war. As the German forces closed in, the Soviet defenders braced themselves. But they didn't just wait to be overwhelmed. They prepared for the fight of their lives, one that would test the limits of human endurance. Into the inferno. What does it feel like to fight in a city that is slowly being turned into a living hell? In the hot summer months of 1942, the once bustling industrial city of Stalingrad became a place of death, destruction, and desperation. As the German forces began their brutal bombardment of the city, they left a scene of unimaginable devastation in their wake. Buildings were reduced to rubble, the streets became rivers of dirt and ash, and the very air was filled with the scent of smoke and despair. The city was no longer a place of life. It was a battleground where both sides would fight for survival. But what the Germans did not count on was the resilience of the Soviet people. Every inch of Stalingrad was fiercely defended. Ordinary citizens, including men, women, and even children, took up arms to protect their homes and their families. They weren't just defending a city, they were defending their very existence. The Soviets didn't just want to win, They needed to win. The battle that ensued in the streets of Stalingrad was unlike any seen before. The Germans, used to sweeping victories on the open battlefield, found themselves caught in the close-quarters combat of urban warfare. Every street corner, every ruined building became a death trap, where soldiers on both sides engaged in brutal skirmishes. Snipers took to the rooftops, machine guns tore through anything in their path, and the sound of explosions echoed constantly through the city. What had once been a thriving metropolis was now a decimated wasteland, where survival became an act of defiance against the advancing German forces. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the German soldiers began to feel the weight of the battle. The conditions were unbearable: extreme cold, lack of supplies, and constant pressure from the Soviet defenders. Yet, the Germans pressed on, believing victory was still within their grasp. The Soviets, however, were far from beaten. In this hellish battlefield, the true nature of Stalingrad was revealed, not just as a city of industrial importance, but as the heart of Soviet resistance. As the brutal winter of 1942 set in, the soldiers of both sides would find themselves locked in a deadly struggle, not just for victory, but for their very survival. The battle was far from over. The turning point. How does a battle go from a seemingly inevitable defeat to a shocking, world-changing victory? The events leading up to the winter of 1942 saw the Germans pushing further into Stalingrad, believing that victory was within their grasp. However, they had made a crucial mistake. They didn't anticipate the resourcefulness and sheer willpower of the Soviet defenders. Stalingrad was not just any city, it was a symbol, and that made it a fortress unlike any other. By November of 1942, the German Sixth Army was deep inside the city, entrenched in bitter combat. The battle had taken a heavy toll on both sides, and the Germans, stretched thin and struggling with supply shortages, began to show signs of weakness. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership had been quietly working on a plan to turn the tide. Operation Uranus, launched on November 19th, was one of the most daring military strategies of the war. The Soviet forces, who had been under siege for months, now had the upper hand. They launched a massive counteroffensive from the north and south, surrounding the German Sixth Army in the city. It was a classic pincer movement, a maneuver the Germans had themselves used to great success early in the war. But this time, it was the Soviets who would catch their enemy off guard. As the encirclement tightened, the German forces found themselves trapped. They had no way to escape, no way to resupply, and no way to break free. The once confident German commanders, including General Paulus, now faced an impossible situation. The weather had worsened, and the Germans were left exposed, desperate, and vulnerable. The turning point had come. The Germans, who had marched into Stalingrad expecting an easy victory, now found themselves locked in a death trap. The Soviets, with their backs against the wall, had managed to do the unthinkable. They had turned the battle around. But would they be able to hold their ground long enough to force a complete German surrender? Or would the German war machine find a way to escape the tightening Soviet grip? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Stalingrad had become a place where the fate of the entire war would be decided. The death trap. What happens when an army is surrounded with no escape? Trapped in a city that has been reduced to rubble, the German Sixth Army found itself in the midst of a death trap that seemed to close tighter with every passing day. General Friedrich Paulus, commander of the German forces in Stalingrad, knew the situation was dire. His soldiers, once proud and confident, now faced starvation, bitter cold, and a relentless Soviet assault. The encirclement, formed by the Soviet forces of General Zhukov, had cut off all supply lines. The Germans were not only trapped in Stalingrad, they were trapped in a battle for survival. With the weather growing harsher and the Red Army tightening its grip, the Germans realized they had no choice but to fight through the Soviet forces or face complete annihilation. But what they did not anticipate was the brutality of the Soviet counteroffensive. Soviet troops, led by an unrelenting spirit, fought not just for their country, but for their very survival. The Germans, deprived of food, ammunition, and reinforcements, were now fighting against the clock as much as against their Soviet adversaries. As the days wore on, conditions became unbearable. The temperature dropped to sub-zero levels, and many of the German soldiers, already exhausted from months of fighting, were unable to endure the bitter cold. The city itself was a frozen wasteland, and the soldiers had no shelter, no warmth, and no means of escape. Disease and malnutrition began to spread through the ranks, and the once formidable Sixth Army began to crumble under the pressure. The city had become a graveyard. Once proud soldiers, now fighting not for victory, but to stay alive one more day. But even in this bleak environment, the Germans refused to give up. They attempted numerous breakthroughs, sending desperate messages for reinforcements. But the Soviet forces were relentless, and each attempt to escape or break through was met with fierce resistance. The encirclement was unbreakable, and the German army's fate was sealed. Stalingrad, once a symbol of Nazi ambition, had become their tomb. The Great Winter. What does it mean to fight in a war where nature itself becomes an enemy? As the German Sixth Army found itself trapped in Stalingrad, the true horror of winter began to settle in. The city, already a shattered wasteland, was now being engulfed by the brutal Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the soldiers, deprived of proper winter clothing and equipment, struggled to survive the icy conditions. It was no longer just about battling the enemy. It was about battling the elements, too. For the German soldiers, this was a nightmare beyond anything they had expected. They had fought wars in France, Poland, and North Africa, but nothing prepared them for the savage cold of the Russian steppe. The cold seeped into their bones, numbing their senses, and frostbite claimed the lives of many. The lack of food and supplies made it impossible to keep warm, and the German forces, already weakened by months of fighting, were now facing a new kind of horror, one that did not come from enemy soldiers, but from the very environment itself. On the Soviet side, the winter was just as deadly, but the Soviet forces, accustomed to the harsh Russian climate, were better prepared to face the cold. They had an unshakable advantage. They understood how to fight in these conditions. Their soldiers wore proper winter clothing, and their tactics took into account the unforgiving weather. For them, the cold was not a hindrance, it was a weapon. As the days dragged on, the Germans were forced into a desperate struggle for survival. The once proud Sixth Army, trapped and frozen, was slowly being worn down by the elements and the unrelenting Soviet counteroffensive. The sound of gunfire and explosions had been replaced by the howls of the wind and the desperate cries of the wounded. The Great Winter of Stalingrad would become the final test of human endurance, a test that the German forces were failing. The desperation of the Sixth Army. How far can a soldier go when the very essence of survival is at stake? As the winter of 1942 to 1943 deepened, the German Sixth Army found itself on the verge of collapse. The dream of taking Stalingrad had turned into a nightmare, and the soldiers were slowly realizing the grim reality of their situation. Cut off from the rest of the German forces, trapped in a city surrounded by Soviet troops, and struggling against the harsh winter, the men of the Sixth Army were now facing a battle for their very survival. The situation grew increasingly desperate. General Paulus, whose confidence had once been unshakable, began to lose hope. His men were starving, freezing, and dying in droves. Yet, despite the hopelessness of their position, the German officers refused to surrender. Hitler, in a rare moment of obstinacy, ordered Paulus to hold out at all costs, refusing to allow the Sixth Army to retreat. Paulus, caught between his loyalty to Hitler and the reality of his men's suffering, found himself trapped in a moral quandary. But even as the situation deteriorated, the German soldiers were determined to fight on. They attempted to break out of the encirclement in small groups, desperate to make it back to the safety of the German lines. However, the Soviet forces, who had prepared for such attempts, repelled each escape effort with ruthless efficiency. The German soldiers, unable to break free, were now facing an enemy more powerful than they could have imagined. Time. The realization began to set in that the Sixth Army had been sacrificed. The initial plan to take Stalingrad had failed spectacularly. instead of victory. The Germans were facing certain defeat. Yet, despite this, they fought on, driven by the faint hope that help would come or that somehow they could hold out a little longer. But with each passing day, their numbers dwindled. The Germans were running out of time, food, and ammunition. They could no longer sustain the fight. The question now was, who would be the first to break? Would it be Paulus, who held the fate of his men in his hands, or would the soldiers on the front lines give in to the hopelessness of their situation? The fall of the Sixth Army. What does it take to shatter the soul of an army? As the German Sixth Army's desperate struggle continued in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, their fate became inevitable. General Paulus, who had once stood proudly as the commander of the mightiest army in Europe, now found himself facing an unimaginable collapse. His forces, already on the brink of starvation, suffering from frostbite, and devastated by constant Soviet assaults, were reaching the breaking point. Hitler's refusal to accept the reality of defeat had doomed them. By January 1943, the encirclement had tightened, and the German soldiers in Stalingrad knew that their chances of survival were slim. They had run out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The once formidable German Sixth Army, which had swept across Europe with ruthless efficiency, was now reduced to a shattered, frozen remnant of its former self. And yet, the soldiers fought on. Their sense of duty and honor, however misguided, compelled them to continue, even when the odds were stacked against them. In the Soviet camps, the prisoners of war who had been captured were watching with a sense of grim satisfaction. The Germans, who had once terrorized Eastern Europe, were now paying the price for their brutality. But the Soviets were not merciful. While the Germans fought for every last breath, the Soviets showed no sign of halting their relentless advance. For them, Stalingrad wasn't just a military victory. It was a moment of reckoning. Finally, on January 31, 1943, General Paulus made the gut-wrenching decision to surrender. He had been promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler in an effort to force him to fight to the death. But Paulus, despite his loyalty to the Führer, could no longer endure the suffering of his men. The Sixth Army surrender was a death knell to Nazi ambition in the East. The city that had once been a symbol of Nazi power was now a symbol of their failure. The battle for Stalingrad was over, and with it, the myth of the invincible German army. The Soviet victory. What happens when an enemy that seemed unstoppable finally collapses? The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in the war. For the Soviet Union, this was a victory not just on the battlefield, but on a symbolic level as well. Stalingrad had become the place where the Nazis' dreams of world domination were crushed, and the Soviet Union stood triumphant. The victory came at a tremendous cost. However, more than 2 million people had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. The city itself was in ruins, its once thriving factories and homes reduced to rubble. Yet, despite the devastation, the Soviets were elated. The Germans had been defeated in the heart of Soviet territory, and the Red Army's victory was seen as a triumph of the Soviet people's resilience. For the first time, the Germans had been forced to retreat, and the Nazis' previously unstoppable momentum had been shattered. But even as the Soviet Union celebrated, the long-term consequences of the battle were apparent. The victory at Stalingrad had crippled the German war effort in the East, but the war was far from over. The Germans would regroup, and the Soviets knew that they would need to maintain their momentum if they were to push the Nazis back across Eastern Europe. The victory at Stalingrad also brought an important realization to the world. The war was no longer a one-sided affair. The Germans had suffered their first major defeat, and the Soviet Union had demonstrated that they were a force to be reckoned with. The battle for Stalingrad had proven that the Nazis were not invincible, and that a determined enemy could stand up to them. But while Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, the war was far from won. The aftermath and the world's response. What happens when a war turns the world upside down? The aftermath of Stalingrad left an indelible mark on the course of history. Not only had the battle shifted the momentum of World War II, but it had also altered the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad sent shockwaves across Europe and the rest of the world. The Nazi regime, once viewed as unstoppable, had suffered its first significant defeat, and its expansionist ambitions were now in jeopardy. For the Allies, Stalingrad was a sign of hope. The Soviets had proven their resilience, and it became clear that the Germans were not invincible. The victory boosted morale in the Allied ranks, especially in the UK and the United States. The Soviet Union, once seen by many as a struggling power, had proven itself to be a formidable force. The German defeat at Stalingrad was a turning point that would lead to further victories for the Allies as they began to push back the Axis powers on multiple fronts. However, the battle also had devastating consequences. More than 2 million people were affected by the battle's aftermath, and the cost of victory was staggering. The city of Stalingrad, once a thriving industrial hub, was left in ruins. The battle had not only cost countless lives, but had also devastated the Russian economy and infrastructure. It would take years to rebuild the city and recover from the damage. Yet, despite the enormous toll, the Soviets pressed on. The victory at Stalingrad fueled the Red Army's determination to push westward, and in the coming years, they would continue to take back territory from the Germans. The battle for Stalingrad had not only turned the tide of the war, but it also marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the Soviets, it was a victory that would forever be etched in their history as a symbol of their endurance, bravery, and unbreakable spirit. The legacy of Stalingrad. What does a battle leave behind when the dust settles and the guns fall silent? The legacy of Stalingrad is one that has echoed through history, not only as a military turning point, but as a symbol of human resilience and sacrifice. In the years following the battle, Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet strength. The city, now renamed Volgograd, was rebuilt, and the memories of the battle were preserved in museums and memorials dedicated to the bravery of the Soviet people who defended it. For the rest of the world, Stalingrad remains a stark reminder of the horrors of war and the resilience of those who face the impossible. The battle's impact can still be seen in military strategy, where urban warfare became a key lesson. The Battle of Stalingrad changed the way armies approached city combat, teaching future generations about the brutal realities of fighting in dense urban environments. The defeat of the German Sixth Army also marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. While the war would continue for another 2 years, Stalingrad broke the back of the German war machine. The city became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, a beacon of hope for those oppressed by the Nazi regime. In the collective memory of the Soviet people, Stalingrad represented more than just a victory. It represented survival, endurance, and the unyielding will of the human spirit. It was a testament to the sacrifices made by millions, both on the battlefield and on the home front, and it served as a reminder of the cost of victory in a war that would shape the future of the world for generations to come. Conclusion, 200 words. The battle for Stalingrad was not just a conflict between two armies. It was a clash of ideologies, a fight for survival, and a moment that would define the future of the world. The Soviets, despite being trapped, battered, and outnumbered, turned the tide of the war with a single, decisive victory. The defeat of the German Sixth Army shattered Hitler's dreams of world domination and marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. For the Soviet people, Stalingrad was a symbol of their indomitable will, a victory that would fuel their determination to push the Nazis out of their homeland. For the rest of the world, it was a beacon of hope, the realization that the Axis powers could be defeated. The impact of Stalingrad stretched far beyond the battlefield, influencing the course of the war and shaping the post-war world. Though the scars of Stalingrad remained for years, both in the ruined city and in the hearts of those who fought there, the legacy of this battle endures. It remains a testament to the human spirit, the willingness to fight against impossible odds, and the triumph of resilience over tyranny. Stalingrad will forever be remembered as the battle that changed the world.